Welcome to the Billionaire's Choice. Subscribe and turn on notifications to enjoy more heartwarming stories of love and destiny. Let us know where you're watching from, and let's begin today's story. Sometimes the person who changes your life is the one you never bother to impress. Claire Donovan kept repeating that sentence in her head without realizing it as she pushed through the revolving doors of Whitmore Dynamics just after 6 o'clock in the evening. The lobby, polished with marble floors that reflected the soft amber lights overhead, was nearly empty now. Most employees had already gone home, laughing in small groups, making dinner plans, talking about weekend trips she couldn't afford to take. Claire tightened her grip around the canvas tote hanging from her shoulder. Inside was her half-finished lunch, a notebook filled with ideas nobody ever asked to read, and a utility bill she still wasn't sure she could pay before Friday. Another day had ended exactly the same way the last 100 had. She had solved a customer crisis that could have cost the company thousands of dollars, watched her manager present the solution as his own during the afternoon meeting, and smiled politely while everyone applauded him. She had wanted to say something. She almost had. But people on temporary contracts learned quickly that speaking up often cost more than staying quiet. Outside, the cool Seattle evening carried the scent of fresh rain across the downtown streets. The sidewalks glistened beneath rows of streetlights, and office towers mirrored the fading colors of the sunset. Claire slipped her phone into her pocket after ignoring another message from her landlord reminding her that rent would be due in 3 days. She wasn't ready to think about that yet. Instead of heading toward the subway station, she wandered into the small city square across from the office building, where a row of wooden benches overlooked a quiet fountain surrounded by flowering trees. It had become her secret place over the past few months. Somewhere nobody expected anything from her. Somewhere she could breathe. She lowered herself onto the end of an empty bench and let out a long sigh she had been holding in all afternoon. "I really am talking to myself now," she whispered with a tired laugh. "That's probably not a great sign." A voice beside her answered calmly. Some of the most honest conversations happen that way. Claire looked up, startled. A man in a dark gray jacket sat several feet away on the same bench, holding a plain paper cup of coffee. His clothes were simple, clean, but unremarkable. Nothing about him suggested wealth or status. He looked like someone finishing a long day at work, just another professional escaping the office before heading home. "Sorry," Claire said quickly. "I didn't realize anyone was sitting here." The man smiled gently. "You don't have to leave. Public benches work better when they're shared." She hesitated for a second before letting out a nervous chuckle. "Fair enough." Silence settled between them as the fountain splashed softly in the background. Claire expected the awkwardness to grow, but somehow it didn't. The stranger simply sipped his coffee and stared toward the water, never once looking at his phone. That alone felt unusual. Everyone seemed glued to a screen these days. Finally, she shook her head and muttered, mostly to herself, "Do you ever feel like working harder just makes someone else more successful?" The stranger glanced toward her with quiet curiosity. "Sounds like today wasn't your best day." Claire laughed again, this time without humor. "You could say that." She looked around as if checking whether anyone from work might still be nearby before continuing. "Have you ever had a boss who somehow turns your ideas into his ideas?" The man didn't interrupt. He simply nodded once, inviting her to continue. That small gesture was enough. The words she'd been holding back all day came spilling out before she could stop them. She told him about impossible deadlines, customers who deserved better, meetings where the loudest voice always won, and the exhausting feeling of becoming invisible despite doing everything right. She admitted that every morning she promised herself she would quit, and every afternoon she remembered she couldn't afford to. She even laughed at herself for carrying around a notebook filled with suggestions for improving employee morale, knowing nobody with real authority would ever read a single page. The stranger listened without offering empty advice or rehearsed optimism. When she finally stopped talking, embarrassed by how much she had shared with someone whose name she didn't even know, he looked toward the fountain again before speaking quietly. "Maybe the wrong people have been reading your work." Claire frowned. "What does that mean?" He smiled, standing slowly with his empty coffee cup in one hand. "It means good ideas have a way of finding the people they're meant for." Before she could ask another question, he offered a small, respectful nod. "I hope tomorrow surprises you, Claire." Her heart skipped. She had never told him her name. Claire barely slept that night. The stranger's final sentence echoed through her mind long after she had climbed the narrow stairs to her apartment. How had he known her name? She replayed every second of their conversation while staring at the cracked ceiling above her bed. She was certain she had never introduced herself. Maybe he had seen her employee badge before she slipped it into her bag. That had to be the explanation. It was ordinary, logical, and yet something about his calm smile refused to leave her thoughts. The next morning, Whitmore Dynamics buzzed with its usual energy. Elevators opened and closed every few seconds. Coffee cups filled the hallways. Phones rang without pause. Claire settled into her cubicle before 8 o'clock, determined to forget yesterday's disappointment and focus on the mountain of customer requests waiting in her inbox. She quietly solved one issue after another, smoothing over frustrated clients with patience that seemed endless. Around noon, she reached for her notebook, flipping to another blank page where she scribbled a new idea for improving communication between departments. If customer service and product development actually spoke to each other once a week, half of these problems would disappear before they ever reached a customer. She smiled to herself before closing the notebook again. Nobody was going to ask for her opinion anyway. After work, she decided to stop by a small coffee truck parked beside the waterfront before heading home. The owner knew most regular customers by name and greeted everyone with the same cheerful smile. As Claire stepped into line, a familiar voice spoke behind her. "You survived today." She turned around, surprised to find the stranger from the park holding another plain paper cup. "You again?" she asked with a laugh. "Either this city is much smaller than I thought, or you keep following me." He smiled. "I was about to accuse you of the same thing." She shook her head, unable to stop smiling back. "I hope you have a better defense than that." "I come here every Wednesday," he replied. "Habit is a difficult thing to break." She considered that before nodding. "Fair enough. I guess today is my first Wednesday." They ordered coffee and walked toward the waterfront, where ferries crossed Elliott Bay beneath a sky streaked with orange and purple. Office workers hurried past them, but neither of them seemed interested in rushing anywhere. Claire found herself talking more easily than before. She told him she had moved to Seattle 3 years earlier with dreams of building a meaningful career. Instead, she felt like she had become another invisible employee hidden behind spreadsheets and customer complaints. The stranger listened with the same quiet attention that had made speaking feel strangely effortless. "Have you ever thought about leaving?" he asked. Claire looked across the water before answering. "Every single day? But leaving without somewhere to go is just another way of falling." He nodded slowly as though he understood far more than she expected. "So you stay because you still believe things can change?" She laughed softly. "No, I stay because rent still exists." He laughed with her, and the sound felt genuine, warm enough to make her forget how exhausting the week had been. Before they parted, he noticed the corner of her notebook sticking out of her canvas tote. "Is that where you keep your ideas?" Claire looked embarrassed. "Just random thoughts. Random ideas have changed entire companies." She smiled politely. "Maybe. Mine mostly collect dust." He looked at the notebook for a moment before saying, "Do not underestimate something simply because nobody has recognized its value yet." His words stayed with her through the rest of the evening. Over the next 2 weeks, their unexpected meetings continued. Sometimes it was outside the bookstore where Claire browsed the clearance shelves without buying anything. Sometimes it was in the same quiet square near the fountain. Sometimes it was at the coffee truck where they debated whether rainy afternoons made the city feel lonely or peaceful. She still did not know much about him. He simply introduced himself as Adrian, saying he worked in business consulting and traveled often. He asked thoughtful questions, but rarely talked about himself. Claire never noticed that several passing executives quietly greeted him with respectful nods before quickly looking away. She never questioned why security guards occasionally recognized his face from across the street. To her, he was simply the stranger who listened without interrupting, the only person who seemed genuinely interested in hearing what she thought instead of waiting for his turn to speak. And every evening before they said goodbye, Claire slipped her notebook back into her canvas bag, never realizing that Adrian watched it with growing curiosity, wondering how many brilliant ideas were hidden inside pages that nobody else had ever bothered to read. The following Monday began like every other morning inside Whitmore Dynamics, but Adrian Whitmore noticed something he had ignored for far too long. From the privacy of the executive observation room overlooking several departments through one-way glass, He watched employees settle into their routines before the official workday began. Some chatted over coffee. Others hurried toward conference rooms carrying laptops and presentation folders. Claire Donovan quietly walked in carrying the same canvas tote and the same notebook she never seemed to leave behind. She greeted the receptionist with a warm smile, stopped to help a new employee reconnect a stubborn computer monitor, and reached her desk 3 minutes before 8. Nobody applauded her. Nobody even looked up. Adrian folded his arms as the operations director began reviewing the morning reports beside him. Numbers filled the large display across the wall, but Adrian's attention stayed on one person. "Who handles the North American customer retention accounts?" he asked without taking his eyes off Claire. The director glanced at his tablet. "Officially, that is managed by Regional Supervisor Ethan Mercer." Adrian watched Ethan emerge from his office carrying a stack of printed reports. 10 minutes later, Claire approached him with several handwritten notes. She pointed toward the customer satisfaction charts while explaining something with calm confidence. Ethan barely looked at her before taking the pages and walking directly into a management meeting. Nearly an hour passed before Adrian joined that same meeting through a private executive video connection. Ethan confidently presented a new strategy that sounded strangely familiar. Better communication between departments. Weekly coordination meetings. Earlier response to customer complaints. Adrian recognized every point immediately. They matched the ideas Claire had casually described during one of their conversations beside the waterfront. He said nothing. Instead, he simply asked, "Whose proposal is this?" Ethan answered without hesitation. "My team developed it over the weekend." Adrian nodded slowly before ending the call. He did not accuse anyone. Not yet. Facts mattered more than assumptions. Over the next several days, he quietly instructed internal analytics to provide him with detailed workflow records instead of management summaries. The results surprised even him. Claire consistently resolved the highest number of complex customer issues across her department. Her response quality ranked among the best in the company. Internal client feedback repeatedly mentioned her patience, creativity, and professionalism. Yet her performance evaluations remained average. Even stranger, multiple improvement projects credited to Ethan Mercer had originated from emails and draft documents first created by Claire. Adrian leaned back in his chair, studying the reports in silence. He had spent years building Whitmore dynamics around innovation and integrity, believing talented people would naturally rise through the organization. Now he wondered how many voices had disappeared beneath layers of bureaucracy simply because no one important had bothered to listen. That evening, he arrived at the small bookstore 5 minutes early. Claire appeared carrying a paper shopping bag with 2 discounted novels she had found on the clearance shelf. "You actually buy books instead of borrowing them?" Adrian teased gently. She smiled. "Only the ones nobody else seems to want. They are cheaper that way." They wandered through the nearby streets while the city lights slowly reflected across rain-soaked sidewalks. Claire laughed as she described helping an elderly customer reset an online account after nearly an hour on the phone. "He thanked me like I had saved his entire week," she said. "Honestly, that felt better than any performance review." Adrian looked at her thoughtfully. "Do you ever get tired of helping people who never notice how much effort it takes?" She shrugged. "The people who need help usually notice. That is enough." Her answer settled heavily in his mind. She still had no idea that the person walking beside her owned the company she worked so hard to improve. She never complained about salary. She never asked for favors. She never tried to impress him. She simply wanted her work to matter. Before they reached the corner where they always said goodbye, Claire pulled out her notebook and quickly wrote down another idea after spotting a delivery driver struggling with confusing parking signs. "Better directions would probably save hundreds of work hours every month," she murmured. Adrian smiled. "You really cannot stop improving things, can you?" She laughed softly while slipping the notebook back into her bag. "Someone should." Adrian watched her disappear into the evening crowd before quietly looking toward the illuminated Whitmore Dynamics headquarters rising above the city skyline. For the first time in years, he was no longer wondering how to make his company more profitable. He was wondering how many people like Claire had been working there all along, invisible to everyone except the one man who had accidentally met her on a park bench as a complete stranger. Autumn settled over Seattle one quiet afternoon, painting the sidewalks with shades of amber and gold as another week slipped by almost unnoticed. What neither Claire Donovan nor Adrian Whitmore expected was how naturally the stranger, who had once shared a park bench, had become part of each other's routine. They never made formal plans. Somehow they simply kept finding one another. Some evenings, it was outside the little bookstore where Claire searched the clearance shelves for novels with worn covers and forgotten stories. Other evenings, it was beside the waterfront where ferries crossed Elliott Bay while seagulls drifted overhead. Once they spent nearly an hour walking through a neighborhood farmer's market debating whether homemade apple pie or fresh blueberry pie deserved the title of the perfect fall dessert. Adrian found himself laughing more than he had in years, not because Claire tried to entertain him, but because she had a way of finding joy inside ordinary moments that money could never purchase. She admired street musicians, thanked cashiers by name, stopped to pet every friendly dog that approached, and somehow managed to notice beautiful things everyone else rushed past. For the first time since building Whitmore Dynamics into one of the country's fastest-growing technology companies, Adrian felt completely invisible in the best possible way. Nobody expected a speech from him. Nobody asked for a decision worth millions of dollars. Nobody watched every word he said hoping to impress him. Claire simply saw him as Adrian, the thoughtful man who enjoyed long walks and listened without interrupting. She had no reason to measure his worth by anything except his character. That realization became more valuable to him than any business award sitting inside his executive office. Meanwhile, Claire began looking forward to the end of each workday for reasons she refused to admit even to herself. Whenever something funny happened at the office, she caught herself thinking that Adrian would probably appreciate the story. Whenever she discovered a new coffee shop or found another interesting book, she wondered whether he would enjoy it too. It had been years since someone had made her feel heard without trying to solve every problem she mentioned. Adrian never rushed to give advice unless she asked for it. Most of the time, he simply asked another thoughtful question that somehow helped her discover the answer herself. One Friday evening, they found themselves sitting once again beside the familiar fountain where everything had begun. The air carried the crisp scent of approaching winter, and tiny lights wrapped around nearby trees reflected gently across the water. Claire opened her notebook while balancing a cup of hot chocolate on the bench beside her. Adrian watched as she filled another page with ideas inspired by conversations she had overheard inside the office cafeteria. "You are writing again," he observed with a smile. Claire nodded without looking up. "I realized new employees feel overwhelmed during their first month. I think the company could create a volunteer mentoring program. It would not even cost much." Adrian asked quietly, "Do you believe someone will eventually read those ideas?" She paused before answering honestly, "Probably not. But writing them down reminds me that I still care. If I stop caring, then I become like everyone who has decided nothing can improve." Adrian looked toward the fountain, deeply moved by the simplicity of her answer. Here was a woman who continued creating solutions even after the world ignored them. She had every excuse to become bitter, yet kindness remained her first instinct. At that moment, he realized the admiration he felt had quietly grown into something much deeper. It was not built on excitement or mystery. It had grown through ordinary conversations, shared laughter, peaceful silences, and countless examples of the person Claire chose to be when nobody important appeared to be watching. Across the city, executives admired Adrian because of his success. Investors respected him because of his fortune. Competitors feared him because of his influence. Claire admired him for entirely different reasons. She believed he was patient, thoughtful, dependable, and genuine because that was exactly who he had. And every time they met, she never asked where he lived. She never wondered what his salary might be. She never imagined he could own the very company that filled so many of their conversations. To her, he was simply the first person who had made an exhausting season of life feel a little less lonely. As they prepared to leave, Claire smiled and tucked the notebook safely back into her canvas tote. "Thank you," she said unexpectedly. Adrian tilted his head. "For what?" She looked at him with complete sincerity. "For reminding me that good people still exist." Adrian returned her smile, but as he watched her disappear into the evening crowd, the warmth in his heart was accompanied by a growing weight he could no longer ignore. Every genuine conversation had brought them closer together, yet every conversation had also been built upon the one truth he had never revealed, and somewhere deep inside he knew that the longer he waited, the more painful that truth would become when the moment finally arrived. The invitation arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning in a simple company email that almost everyone opened without much interest. Whitmore Dynamics was holding its annual town hall meeting on Friday afternoon, and attendance was strongly encouraged for every department. Claire Donovan read the message while finishing her first cup of coffee and assumed it would be another long presentation filled with quarterly numbers, corporate goals, and speeches from executives she had never met. She almost deleted the calendar reminder before deciding she should probably attend. Her manager, Ethan Mercer, spent the next few days acting unusually confident, hinting that senior leadership was about to recognize several important strategic initiatives that had helped improve customer satisfaction across the company. Claire quietly congratulated him, even though every example he proudly mentioned sounded painfully familiar. She recognized the ideas because she had written most of them in her notebook months earlier. Still, she said nothing. She had grown accustomed to watching her work become someone else's achievement. On Thursday evening, she met Adrian near the fountain as they had done so many times before. The air felt colder now, and tiny drops of rain shimmered beneath the streetlights. Adrian seemed more thoughtful than usual. Claire noticed it immediately. "You have that look again," she said with a gentle smile. "What look?" "The one that says you are carrying something you cannot decide whether to say out loud." Adrian looked toward the quiet water before answering. "Have you ever wondered if knowing the whole truth about someone could change everything?" Claire considered the question carefully. "Maybe, but I think intentions matter more than appearances." Adrian smiled faintly. "Even if they kept an important secret?" Claire shrugged. "I suppose it depends on why they kept it." He wanted to tell her everything right then. He wanted to explain that every conversation, every coffee, every walk through the city had become the best part of his week because she treated him like an ordinary man instead of a billionaire. But dozens of employees had already begun preparing for the town hall, and he knew the truth would reveal itself in less than 24 hours. Instead, he simply nodded and said quietly, "Thank you." Claire laughed softly. "You are mysterious sometimes, Adrian." "Not for much longer," he answered almost to himself. Friday arrived with unusual excitement throughout the headquarters. Hundreds of employees gathered inside the large auditorium, filling row after row of seats beneath bright stage lights and enormous presentation screens displaying the company logo. Claire found a seat near the middle beside co-workers from customer relations. Ethan Mercer sat several rows closer to the front with other department managers, smiling confidently as though he expected an important moment. Music faded. Conversation stopped. A member of the executive team stepped onto the stage to welcome everyone before announcing the company's founder and chief executive officer. Claire politely prepared to applaud along with everyone else, expecting to see a face she had only glimpsed once or twice in internal newsletters. Then the auditorium doors opened. Adrian walked calmly onto the stage wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit instead of his familiar gray jacket. The room erupted into applause. Hundreds of employees immediately rose to their feet. Senior executives greeted him with unmistakable respect. Board members smiled as he shook their hands before stepping behind the podium. Claire remained frozen in her chair. Her heartbeat seemed to disappear altogether. She stared at the stage without blinking, convinced for one impossible second that there had to be another Adrian who happened to look exactly like the man she had spent weeks laughing with beside the waterfront. But there was no mistake. It was him, the stranger from the park bench, the man who carried ordinary paper coffee cups, the quiet listener who had encouraged her to keep writing inside her notebook, the man she believed worked in business consulting. He looked across the audience while thanking everyone for attending, and for the briefest moment his eyes found hers. His expression softened with unmistakable recognition before he continued speaking to the crowd. Claire felt every conversation they had shared replaying inside her mind with completely different meaning. Every question he had asked, every thoughtful silence, every discussion about her workplace, every hopeful sentence that had seemed strangely insightful. Suddenly, they all made perfect sense. Around her, co-workers listened attentively to their celebrated billionaire chief executive officer. Claire heard almost nothing. She could only stare at the man on the stage and wonder how the person she had trusted most had also managed to keep the biggest truth of all hidden behind the simplest smile. Claire remained seated long after the applause had faded. Around her, employees eagerly discussed the speech, praising Adrian Whitmore's vision and leadership while gathering their belongings to leave the auditorium. Their voices blended into meaningless background noise. She could not hear anything except the countless conversations she had shared with him over the past several weeks. Every quiet walk, every cup of coffee, every encouraging word, every thoughtful question. None of it had been imaginary, yet suddenly all of it felt different. She slowly stood and made her way toward the exit, hoping to disappear into the crowd before anyone noticed the expression on her face. Claire. His voice stopped her only a few steps outside the auditorium doors. She closed her eyes for a brief second before turning around. Adrian had removed his suit jacket and loosened his tie, looking more like the man from the park bench than the billionaire who had just addressed hundreds of employees. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Adrian took one careful step closer. "I was hoping we could talk." Claire looked at him with quiet disbelief. "Talk?" she repeated. "About which part? The part where you listened to me complain about this company while secretly owning it, or the part where you let me believe you were someone completely different?" Adrian did not try to interrupt. "You deserve an explanation." She gave a sad smile that never reached her eyes. "Do I? Because it feels like the only person in those conversations who did not know the truth was me." Employees continued walking past them without realizing anything unusual was happening. Adrian lowered his voice. "I never wanted to make you feel foolish." "You did not make me feel foolish because you are rich," Claire answered calmly. "You made me feel foolish because I trusted you." Those words landed harder than any criticism Adrian had received in a board meeting or business negotiation. She was not angry about his success. She was hurt because honesty had mattered more to her than status from the very beginning. Adrian looked at her with complete sincerity. "Everything I felt during those conversations was real." Claire nodded slowly. "I believe that. The problem is I do not know which version of you is real." Silence settled between them. The distance separating them suddenly felt much greater than the few feet of polished hallway beneath their shoes. After several long seconds, Claire reached into her canvas tote and gently touched the corner of her notebook. "Do you know what I liked most about talking with you?" Adrian shook his head. "I never worried about saying the wrong thing. I thought I was speaking to someone who had no power over my career. I could be completely honest. Now, every conversation feels different because I cannot stop wondering whether you were evaluating me the entire time." Adrian answered immediately. "I never judged you." Claire looked at him with tired eyes. "Maybe not, but you always knew exactly who I was. I never had that same chance." She offered a small, respectful nod before walking away. Adrian watched her disappear into the elevator without trying to stop her again. He knew chasing after her would only make the moment worse. The following Monday, Claire submitted a formal request for personal leave. She needed time away from the office to think clearly. Human Resources approved several vacation days that she had never used, and by noon her desk sat unusually quiet. Coworkers assumed she simply needed a break after the busy quarter. Adrian noticed her empty chair the moment he reviewed the morning floor reports. Later that afternoon, he walked through the customer relations department under the pretense of meeting with managers. His eyes instinctively searched for the familiar canvas tote and well-worn notebook that were no longer there. Ethan Mercer greeted him enthusiastically, eager to discuss recent department achievements, but Adrian barely listened. Something much more important had become painfully obvious. Claire had never wanted anything from him except honesty, and in trying to protect the ordinary friendship they had built together, he had unintentionally become the very reason she no longer felt comfortable walking into work. Standing silently outside the empty cubicle where she had spent countless hours solving problems for everyone else, Adrian made a decision. Winning back Claire's trust would not begin with another conversation or another apology. It would begin with uncovering the truth about everything she had tried to tell him. Every ignored idea inside her notebook, every accomplishment hidden beneath someone else's name, and every quiet injustice that had been allowed to continue for far too long. Claire spent the next several days away from Whitmore Dynamics, leaving her alarm clock turned off for the first time in months. Instead of rushing into crowded elevators and answering endless customer calls, she walked through neighborhood parks with a cup of coffee in her hands, trying to quiet the questions that refused to leave her mind. She missed talking to Adrian far more than she wanted to admit, but every memory now carried two versions of the same man. One was the thoughtful stranger who had listened without judgment. The other was the billionaire chief executive officer who had known exactly who she was from the beginning. Meanwhile, inside the executive offices overlooking downtown Seattle, Adrian had already begun a very different kind of investigation. He instructed the internal audit team to gather every customer service report, project proposal, performance evaluation, and departmental recommendation connected to the customer relations division over the previous 18 months. Unlike previous reviews, this one would bypass department managers entirely. He wanted original files, complete revision histories, email records, and submission timestamps. By the second day, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Claire Donovan's name appeared repeatedly inside draft documents that were later submitted under Ethan Mercer's name. Suggestions she had casually mentioned beside the waterfront were already sitting inside archived files months before Ethan presented them as executive strategies. Weekly cross-department meetings, new employee mentoring, faster communication between product development and customer support, improved parking instructions for delivery partners, customer retention improvements. Every one of them traced back to Claire. Adrian quietly read through hundreds of pages without saying a word. What disturbed him even more than the stolen ideas was the consistency. Claire never complained in writing. She never accused anyone. She simply continued submitting thoughtful recommendations that disappeared into management without recognition. Human resources records painted an equally troubling picture. Her annual evaluations repeatedly described her as dependable but lacking leadership visibility. Yet anonymous peer feedback described her as the first person coworkers approached whenever they needed help solving complicated customer problems. Customer satisfaction surveys mention her name more often than anyone else in the department. The evidence told one clear story. The company had overlooked one of its most valuable employees because the wrong people controlled the narrative. Adrian requested a confidential meeting with the director of internal compliance. Together, they reviewed every document late into the evening. There were no dramatic confrontations, no raised voices, only facts arranged one after another until the truth became undeniable. Several managers had consistently accepted credit for ideas developed by junior employees. Performance reviews had been influenced more by presentation visibility than actual contribution. Recognition programs rewarded those who spoke the loudest instead of those who quietly improved the business every single day. Adrian closed the final report and looked out across the Seattle skyline. He remembered Claire sitting beside the fountain, smiling as she said that writing down ideas reminded her she still cared. She had continued believing in the company long after the company had stopped believing in her. That realization weighed heavily on him. Later that evening, Adrian unlocked a secure storage cabinet containing personal items employees had voluntarily submitted during office renovations several months earlier. Inside sat a familiar canvas tote with a small tag attached to it. Claire had temporarily left it behind during a workspace reorganization and never bothered retrieving it because she had switched to another bag. Inside rested the worn notebook he had noticed from the very beginning. He hesitated before opening it, reminding himself that he was not searching for private thoughts. He was searching for the truth she had tried so hard to contribute. Page after page contained practical ideas, thoughtful observations, and detailed sketches explaining how small changes could improve employee morale, customer satisfaction, and teamwork. Between those pages, Adrian found something that stopped him completely. Written in neat handwriting across the top of one page were the words, "Leadership is not about being the smartest person in the room. It is about making everyone else feel like their best ideas matter." Adrian quietly closed the notebook and held it in both hands. Claire had written that long before she ever knew who he really was. She had unknowingly described the kind of leader he had always hoped to become. At that moment, he understood that repairing the damage between them would never begin with asking for another chance. It had to begin by proving, through actions instead of promises, that the values she believed in still had a place inside the company they both cared about. Claire returned to Whitmore Dynamics the following Monday, expecting nothing more than another ordinary workday. She had decided that keeping her professional life separate from her personal disappointment was the only mature choice she could make. She greeted the receptionist with her usual smile, placed her canvas tote beneath her desk, and opened her inbox. Within minutes, an unexpected company-wide email appeared. Every employee was asked to attend a special afternoon meeting in the main auditorium. No agenda was included. Curious conversations quickly spread across every floor. Some employees guessed there would be another corporate announcement. Others whispered about organizational changes. Ethan Mercer walked confidently through the department, assuring everyone there was probably nothing to worry about. Claire simply continued answering customer emails until it was time to head downstairs. The auditorium filled once again, but this atmosphere felt different from the previous gathering. There were no promotional banners or upbeat music. Senior executives sat quietly near the front, while members of the compliance team occupied an entire section beside the stage. Adrian Whitmore stepped to the podium without dramatic introduction. He looked across the room for several seconds before speaking. Over the past 2 weeks, I requested an independent review of how ideas, contributions, and employee performance have been recognized across our company. What we discovered requires immediate action. The room became completely silent. Adrian continued with calm confidence rather than anger. Innovation only matters when the people creating it receive the credit they deserve. Leadership only deserves respect when it protects fairness instead of convenience. Large screens behind him displayed timelines showing project development histories without revealing confidential information. Employees watched as original proposal dates appeared beside later executive presentations. The evidence was clear. Several initiatives celebrated over the past year had not originated from department leadership at all. Adrian announced that multiple management decisions would take effect immediately following the investigation. Ethan Mercer and several supervisors would no longer remain in leadership positions because they had failed to uphold the company's standards of integrity and accountability. There was no applause, only quiet surprise as everyone realized the company was confronting uncomfortable truths instead of ignoring them. Adrian paused before continuing. There is one more person I need to recognize today. Claire lowered her eyes, assuming another executive would receive an award. Instead, Adrian looked directly toward the middle rows where she sat. Claire Donovan, would you please join me on stage? Hundreds of heads turned at once. Claire remained frozen in her seat until a co-worker gently whispered, "That is you." With uncertain steps, she walked toward the stage, completely unaware of what was about to happen. Adrian greeted her with a respectful smile, leaving enough distance to make it clear this was not a personal moment, but a professional one. He held up a familiar notebook. Claire immediately recognized the worn cover. This notebook contains months of thoughtful ideas focused on helping coworkers succeed, improving customer experiences, and strengthening this company, Adrian said. Our investigation confirmed that many of these ideas were submitted through proper channels, but never credited to the person who created them. That mistake belongs to this organization, not to Claire. He handed the notebook back to her with both hands. Today we correct that mistake. Another screen illuminated behind them, listing initiatives that would now be implemented. Company-wide, with Claire officially recognized as their original author. The audience remained quiet for a heartbeat before sincere applause gradually filled the auditorium. It was not loud because people had been instructed to clap. It grew naturally as employees understood what had truly happened. Many of Claire's co-workers stood first. Others quickly followed until nearly the entire room was on its feet. Claire looked across the audience with tears gathering in her eyes, overwhelmed not by attention, but by something she had almost stopped believing existed. Fairness. Adrian waited until the applause settled before speaking one final time. Recognition is not a gift from leadership. It is a responsibility. Every person who works here deserves to know that good work will never again disappear because someone else has a louder voice or a more impressive title. We will build that culture together. Claire looked at Adrian differently than she had after the shocking revelation days earlier. The hurt had not disappeared. The unanswered questions still remained between them. But standing there, watching him risk his own reputation to publicly admit the company's failures instead of quietly hiding them, she finally understood that he was not asking for forgiveness with empty words. He was earning it through actions, exactly the way true leadership always should. 1 year later, the lobby of Whitmore Dynamics looked different, although most visitors could not immediately explain why. The marble floors still reflected the morning sunlight. The glass walls still overlooked the Seattle skyline. Employees still hurried toward meetings carrying coffee cups and laptop bags. But something had quietly changed inside the building itself. New employees were welcomed by volunteer mentors during their first week. Every project proposal included transparent authorship records. Monthly innovation meetings invited ideas from every department regardless of job title. Customer satisfaction had reached the highest level in company history, but Adrian Whitmore often said the company's greatest achievement could not be measured on a financial report. It was trust. Claire Donovan had become Director of Employee Experience, a position created specifically to strengthen communication, recognize overlooked talent, and ensure every employee had a voice. Her office door rarely stayed closed. She still walked through every department, introducing herself to new hires, asking thoughtful questions, and listening more than she spoke. Many employees assumed she had always been part of senior leadership because she carried herself with quiet confidence instead of authority. She still brought her lunch from home several days each week. She still thanked the cleaning staff every evening before leaving. Most importantly, she still carried a notebook, although the old worn one now rested safely inside a wooden display case in her office beside a simple plaque that read, "Every great improvement begins as one person's unnoticed idea." Adrian often smiled whenever he walked past it. On a cool autumn evening, almost exactly 1 year after they first met, Adrian sent Claire a short message asking if she had time for a walk after work. There was no mention of meetings or company business. Only one sentence. "Meet me where everything started." Claire smiled before slipping on her coat. Some places never lost their meaning. The familiar park bench still overlooked the quiet fountain. Golden leaves drifted through the air exactly as they had the evening she had unknowingly shared her frustrations with a complete stranger. Adrian was already waiting, wearing the same simple gray jacket instead of an expensive suit. In one hand, he held 2 paper cups of coffee. In the other rested something wrapped in dark blue ribbon. "I thought we could keep one tradition," he said with a warm smile as he handed her a coffee. Claire laughed softly. "You finally remembered what I order without asking." Adrian smiled. "I learned from the best listener I have ever known." They sat together watching the fountain for several peaceful minutes without speaking. The silence no longer felt uncertain. It felt comfortable, built through months of honest conversations after everything had changed. Eventually, Adrian handed her the small package. Claire carefully untied the ribbon and opened the box. Inside rested her original notebook, restored with a beautifully crafted leather cover that protected every handwritten page she had filled during the most difficult season of her life. Tucked inside the front cover was a single folded letter. She looked at Adrian before opening it. His familiar handwriting filled the page. "The night we met, I thought I was escaping the pressure of leading a company for a few quiet minutes. Instead, I met someone who reminded me why I wanted to lead in the first place. Your ideas made this company better. Your honesty made me better. Thank you for seeing the person before the title, even though I did not deserve that trust at first." Claire closed the letter slowly, her eyes glistening. "You kept this?" she whispered. Adrian nodded. "I wrote it the day after we met. I never had the courage to give it to you until I believed my actions finally matched those words." He took a slow breath before reaching into his jacket pocket and revealing a small ring box. He did not kneel immediately. Instead, he looked directly into her eyes, just as he had on the park bench a year earlier. "Claire, the greatest lesson you ever taught me was that leadership and love both begin the same way. They begin by listening. I cannot promise that life will always be easy, but I can promise that I will always tell you the truth, always respect your voice, and always choose to walk beside you instead of ahead of you. Will you marry me?" Tears slipped gently down Claire's cheeks as she smiled through quiet laughter. "Only if you promise we never stop meeting on this bench." Adrian laughed with unmistakable relief. "That is the easiest promise I have ever made." "Then yes," she answered. 1,000 times yes." As he placed the ring on her finger, the fountain sparkled beneath the evening lights, just as it had the day two strangers accidentally shared a conversation that neither of them could have imagined would change both their lives forever, proving that true wealth is never measured by the size of a fortune, but by the courage to recognize the value in another human being before anyone else does. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share, and subscribe to the Billionaire's Choice. Every week, we bring you heartwarming stories of love, destiny, and life-changing decisions. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a new story.